Baseball Hall of Fame president Jeff Idelson says Hall of Fame catcher Gary Carter has died. Gary Carter had been fighting brain cancer for well over a year now.
When Dad was first getting the symptoms of just not feeling good and we weren't really sure what was going on, people were wanting to know more and, of course, wanted to know the journey. And somebody had told me about a thing called Caring Bridge, and I could do this online journal. Then everybody got to read the story, and they got to pray with us and cry with us and be with us.
Devastating news. The smiling baseball legend millions of fans called the Kid was fighting a battle almost nobody could believe. A man who had spent his life grinning through pain, pushing through heartbreak, and lifting everyone around him was now facing something that even his enormous heart could not outrun. Brain cancer. 4 tumors. The kind doctors call inoperable. The news hit the baseball world like a punch to the chest. Fans who had watched Gary Carter play for nearly 2 decades stood still when they heard it. They remembered that wide, warm smile. They remembered the hustle. They remembered the joy. And now they were being told that joy was under attack. I'm Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. The Gary Carter was not just a baseball player. He was a feeling. When you watched him play, you felt like the game was fun again. You felt like hard work still mattered. You felt like a man could be genuinely, deeply happy just to be on that field. He ran out every ground ball. He dove for every foul pop. He called every pitcher by name and knew every batter's weakness. He was the guy who made catching look like the greatest job in the world. And he did it all with that smile. That enormous, unstoppable smile that his teammates teased him about, that fans fell in love with, and that never went away even when life got very hard. But here's the truth about Gary Carter. The smile was real. The joy was real, and so was the pain. Because long before brain cancer entered the picture, Gary Carter's life had already been shaped by loss and struggle that most people never knew. He carried those things quietly. He carried them with faith, but they were there. And understanding them is the only way to truly understand who he was and why his story still matters. Gary Edmund Carter was born on April 8, 1954, in Culver City, California. His father, James, had come to California after World War II and worked in technical roles in Hollywood, eventually landing jobs with Hughes Aircraft and McDonnell Douglas. His mother, Inge, had been a champion swimmer. Gary inherited her athletic genes fully and completely. As a small boy growing up in Fullerton, California, he was already winning competitions. When he was just 7 years old, he won the national punt, pass, and kick competition in the 7-year-old category, right there at the Los Angeles Coliseum. That was 1961. A 7-year-old winning a national competition. That tells you something about who Gary Carter was going to become. But the story took its first dark turn when Gary was only 12 years old. In May of 1966, just 1 month after his 12th birthday, his mother Inge died. She was 37 years old. She had been battling leukemia. Gary lost her, 12 years old, no mother. The grief hit him hard. He pushed away the religious faith his family had always held. He could not understand how a loving God could take someone so important, so young, so central to everything good in his life. He was angry. He was lost. And he did what many young athletes do when they have nowhere else to turn. He threw himself into sports. Every sport he could find. Every game. Every practice. Every competition. The sports became his answer to a question he did not know how to ask. At Sunny Hills High School in Fullerton, Gary Carter became something of a legend. He did not just play sports, he dominated them. He captained the varsity football team, he captained the basketball team, he captained the baseball team. He was also an honor student and a member of the National Honor Society. He played American Legion baseball and was named the 1971 American Legion Graduate of the Year. He was, by every measure, the complete package. College coaches from across the country noticed he received nearly 100 athletic scholarship offers. 100. He signed a letter of intent to play quarterback for the UCLA Bruins. His football future looked bright, it looked certain. Then came the second blow. During his senior year, Gary suffered severely torn ligaments in his right knee. A pioneering sports surgeon named Dr. Robert Kurlan examined the injury and gave him a stark warning. Another high-impact tackle, another violent collision on a football field could end his athletic career permanently. Just like that, the football future was gone. Gary Carter had to make a choice. He chose baseball. The Montreal Expos had selected him in the 3rd round of the 1972 amateur draft. He signed with them and never looked back. But it is worth pausing here. Before Gary Carter ever played a single major league game, he had already lost his mother and given up his first athletic dream. The story of the Kid had already been marked by real loss. The grin you saw on the field was not the grin of someone who had never suffered. It was the grin of someone who had decided to keep going anyway. When Gary joined the Montreal organization, something interesting happened almost immediately. The scouts and coaches who had signed him, men like Bob Zook, Bobby Maddock, and farm director Mel Didier, looked at his physical frame and his mental sharpness and decided he should be a catcher. There was just one problem. The Gary Carter had played only 6 games as a catcher in his entire life. He had mostly been a shortstop, a third baseman, and a pitcher. Catching was almost a foreign language to him, but he learned it. He learned it fast, he learned it so thoroughly that it would eventually become his entire identity. His minor league rise was remarkable. By 1974, he had earned Topps AAA All-Star honors with the Memphis Blues. That same September, he was called up to the big leagues and made his debut at Montreal's Jerry Park on September 16, 1974. In his first 27 at-bats, he hit 407. On September 28, 1974, he hit his first major league home run, and he hit it off Steve Carlton, a future Hall of Famer. Gary Carter announced himself to the world in the boldest possible way. In 1975, Montreal gave him uniform number 8. Gary loved that number. He had been born on April 8th. He married his wife Sandy on February 8th. He moved into his first home on November 8th. The number felt like more than a number. It felt like a sign, like the universe was paying attention. During his rookie season, his manager Gene Mauch played him mostly in the outfield to keep veteran catcher Barry Foote in the lineup. It was not Carter's natural position. He ran into outfield walls. He dove for balls on rough turf. He took hits that no one should take while playing out of position, but he hit 270 with 17 home runs and 68 runs batted in. He earned his first All-Star selection. He finished second in the National League Rookie of the Year voting. Out of position, learning on the fly, taking punishment, and still putting up numbers good enough to finish second in the rookie race. That was Gary Carter. If you appreciate the kind of athlete who gives everything regardless of the circumstances, take a second to use the hype feature and support this video, because stories like Gary Carter's deserve to be remembered and shared. A hand injury from a violent outfield collision with teammate Pepe Mangual in June of 1976 finally pushed the Expos to make the decision permanent. Gary Carter was going to be a full-time catcher from 1977 forward, and what followed was one of the most extraordinary defensive careers the position had ever seen. In 1977, he joined Johnny Bench and Jim Sundberg as the only modern catchers to record more than 100 assists in a single season. In 1978, his peak defensive year, he set a major league record by committing only a single passed ball over the entire season. 1. For an entire year. That is not skill alone. That is obsession. That is the kind of focus that borders on superhuman. Over his 19-year career, Gary Carter led National League catchers 8 times in putouts, 5 times in assists, 3 times in caught stealing percentage. He threw out 810 would-be base stealers, the highest total for any catcher in the post-dead ball era. His career wins above replacement of 70, one was the second highest ever recorded for a catcher. He played 2,056 games behind the plate, 4th on the all-time list. He had 2,092 career hits, 324 home runs total with 307 of them coming as a catcher, and 1,125 runs batted in. His fielding percentage of the 991 was 5 full points above the league average for his era. These are not just numbers. These are the measurements of a man who gave everything to a position that gives nothing back easily, because catching is brutal. There is no other word for it. The position demands that you squat hundreds of times per game, that you block pitches with your body, that you take foul tips off your hands and arms and mask, that you absorb collisions from runners who have no intention of slowing down. Gary Carter did all of this for nearly 2 decades. He played through cortisone shots. In 1988 alone, he received 6 cortisone shots just to get through the season. 6. Not because the doctors told him he was fine, because Gary Carter refused to quit. He caught through immense pain so often that his teammates eventually stopped being surprised by it and started being awed by it. The physical price he paid was enormous. His knees were wrecked. His hands were beaten. His body absorbed years of punishment that no normal person could sustain. He eventually needed total right knee replacement surgery. But here's what matters. He never once used the pain as an excuse. He never pointed to the injuries and said, "Look what this cost me." He just kept going. He kept smiling. He kept working. By the early 1980s, Gary Carter had become one of the best players in the National League, not just among catchers, but at any position. In 1980, he hit 29 home runs, drove in 101 runs, and finished runner-up to Mike Schmidt in the National League Most Valuable Player voting. In the strike-shortened 1981 season, he caught Charlie Lea's no-hitter. In May, when the season resumed after the work stoppage, He hit 2 solo home runs in the 1981 All-Star Game in Cleveland to win the MVP award. It was a moment that felt larger than just a game. The baseball had been through a painful, messy labor dispute. Fans were angry. The sport needed something to remind people why they cared. And Gary Carter, in the middle of an All-Star game, hit 2 home runs and reminded the entire country that baseball was still worth loving. The Expos, buoyed by Carter's brilliance, won the NL East title for the second half of that split 1981 season, the only playoff appearance in franchise history. Carter rose to the moment. He recorded hits in all 10 postseason games. He batted .421 in the division series against the Philadelphia Phillies. He batted .438 in the championship series against the Los Angeles Dodgers. He was everything the Expos needed him to be and more. Before the 1982 season, Carter signed a landmark contract, 7 years, $15 million. It was one of the biggest contracts in baseball at the time, but the Expos struggled to build a winning team around their star catcher. The money the franchise had invested in Carter left little room to bring in the supporting cast a championship team requires. By December of 1984, after Carter led the National League with 106 runs batted in, Montreal traded him to the New York Mets in exchange for 4 players. It was the deal that changed everything for New York. The Mets' general manager, Frank Cashin, had been searching for a right-handed power hitter and a defensive anchor. Carter filled both needs immediately. Manager Davey Johnson later said that Carter was a one-man scouting system. He kept a detailed notebook on every batter in the National League. He knew their tendencies, their patterns, their weaknesses. He was the ideal partner for the Mets' young and volatile pitching staff. Dwight Gooden, Ron Darling, Bobby Ojeda, the Sid Fernandez. Carter guided them all. In 1986, the Mets were the best team in baseball. And Carter was a massive reason why he batted. 2006 is with 24 home runs and 105 runs batted in during the regular season, finishing 3rd in the National League MVP vote. But the regular season was just the warm-up. The postseason was where Gary Carter became a legend that can never be erased. In Game 5 of the National League Championship Series against the Houston Astros, with the series tied and the game going deep into extra innings, the Carter stepped up in the 12th inning and hit a walk-off single to score Wally Backman. The Mets won the game and took control of the series. Then came the World Series against the Boston Red Sox, one of the most dramatic World Series in the history of the sport. In Game 4 at Fenway Park, Carter hit 2 home runs. That made him the only player in baseball history to hit multiple home runs in both an All-Star game and a World Series game. Then came Game 6. That game, the game that everyone who was alive and watching remembers. The Mets were trailing the Red Sox by 2 runs in the bottom of the 10th inning. There were 2 outs. The Mets were 1 strike away from losing the World Series. And Gary Carter came to the plate. He was not going to let it end. He lined a single to left field off reliever Calvin Schiraldi. That single started everything. The Mets scored 3 runs and won the game. Teammate Tim Teufel later recalled that after Carter scored the first run of the comeback, he sprinted into the dugout, shouted that the Mets were still alive, and immediately began putting on his catching gear for the 11th inning. He was already preparing for the next challenge before the current one had even finished. That was Gary Carter, always forward, always fighting. But here's the part of the Gary Carter story that tends to get left out when people only talk about the highlights. Inside those clubhouses, particularly in Montreal and in New York, Gary Carter was not universally beloved. He was teased. He was mocked. He was, at times, genuinely isolated. The nickname? The kid had started out affectionately. It was coined during his very first spring training in 1973 by teammates Tim Foley, Ken Singleton, and Mike Jorgensen, who admired his relentless hustle. But in the early years, veteran players used it mockingly. The pitcher Don Carruthers used it sarcastically to needle the starting catcher Barry Foote, setting a tone of clubhouse skepticism that followed Carter for a long time. As his fame grew, his teammates in both Montreal and New York gave him other nicknames. Camera Carter, Lights, Teeth. They said he smiled too much. They said he talked to reporters too eagerly. They said he was performing rather than being genuine. In Jeff Pearlman's detailed history of the 1986 Mets, Carter's clean-cut lifestyle was openly mocked by players who called him a geek. In clubhouses defined by late-night partying and hard living, Gary Carter was the guy who went home to his family. He had married his high school sweetheart, Sandy Lom, on February 8, 1975. He had 3 children, Christy, Kimmy, and DJ. His priorities were different from many of his teammates, and that made him a target. The Warren Cromartie and Darryl Strawberry both later admitted that they had pushed Carter away during their younger years, driven by their own insecurities and immaturity. Gary Carter stood alone in a lot of those dugouts and locker rooms. He was the man with the biggest smile and sometimes the fewest friends. He gave everything to those teams and those teammates, and in return, many of them quietly looked down on him for being different. That is a kind of loneliness that no box score can measure, and he carried it without complaint. But durability tells a story over time. The Gary Carter's integrity, his toughness, his unwavering steadiness, all of that eventually won over the people who had doubted him. Ron Darling, one of those young Mets pitchers Carter guided so carefully, later called him the moral compass of the team. He recognized that Carter's clean living and steady character had provided something essential, a foundation, a standard, something worth measuring yourself against. And Darryl Strawberry, years later, said something that must have meant the world to Carter's family. He said he wished he could have lived his life like Gary Carter. He said Gary was a true man, coming from Strawberry, who had lived through his own storms. That tribute meant everything. The faith that made Gary Carter who he was had a specific origin. It grew from the grief of losing his mother. During his 1973 rookie spring training camp in Montreal, the Expos assigned him to room with a veteran catcher named John Boccabella. The Boccabella was a devout Catholic who held Sunday services for the team. He and Gary became close friends. Boccabella shared scripture with the young Carter. He also introduced him to the writings of legendary basketball coach John Wooden, and something shifted. The anger Gary had carried since his mother's death in 1966 began to find a way out. Not through forgetting her, not through pretending the loss had not happened, but through finding a framework that let him carry it without being crushed by it. He later described this spiritual recovery as the most important decision of his life. He said it gave him the strength to face personal challenges with joy rather than anger. That faith became visible in everything Gary Carter did. Instead of signing standard autographs, he printed small cards sharing his personal testimony, his own story of faith, and he carried them in his Bible to hand out to fans who asked for his signature. His faith was not something he kept private and separate from his public life. He wore it openly. He offered it freely, and he backed it up with action. The Gary Carter Foundation was the clearest expression of everything he believed. He established it to improve the lives of children in underprivileged communities. The foundation supported 8 Title I schools in Palm Beach County, schools where more than 90% of students qualified for free or reduced lunch. It integrated reading programs to raise literacy levels in elementary schools. It funded leukemia research, the very disease that had taken his mother at 37. It provided athletic equipment and academic support to the Fullerton Boys and Girls Club, the very club where Gary himself had grown up. It funded specialized education and therapeutic services for children with autism through the Autism Project of Palm Beach County. Over time, the Gary Carter Foundation raised and distributed more than $622,000 for these causes. That money came from a man who remembered what it felt like to be a 12-year-old boy who had just lost his mother and needed the world to give him something to hold on to. He was trying to be that something for other kids. Following his retirement from Major League Baseball in 1992, Carter worked as a television color commentator for the Florida Marlins from 1993 to 1996. Then he came back to the field as a roving catching instructor and minor league manager for the New York Mets. He excelled at it. In 2005, he won the Gulf Coast League Manager of the Year award with the rookie-level Gulf Coast Mets. In 2006, he guided the Class A St. Lucie Mets to the Florida State League Championship, earning his second straight Manager of the Year award. He managed the Orange County Flyers to a Golden Baseball League title in 2008 and led the Long Island Ducks to a division title in 2009. In October of 2009, Palm Beach Atlantic University hired Carter as the head baseball coach for their NCAA Division II program. He was one of only 2 active Hall of Fame players coaching in college baseball at that time, the other being Tony Gwynn at San Diego State. The program Carter inherited had won only 7 games the prior year, 7. He took them to 17 wins in his first season and 27 wins in his second. He was not just coaching baseball, he was rebuilding something. He was instilling discipline and purpose and character into young men who needed exactly what Gary Carter had always offered, an example worth following. He had also undergone total right knee replacement surgery in October of 2004, which finally freed him from years of pain in that long-abused joint. After the surgery, he was able to actively throw batting practice and hit fungos again. Even after everything his body had been through, he was still out on the field, doing the work himself. Still hands-on, still fully present. That was Gary Carter to the very end of his coaching life. Then, in May of 2011, shortly after finishing his second season coaching at Palm Beach Atlantic, the headaches started. They were severe and persistent. Fatigue followed. So did memory lapses. The kind of forgetting that does not feel like ordinary forgetfulness. It feels like something is wrong. Gary went in for an MRI scan on May 21, 2011. The scan revealed 4 small brain tumors. The biopsies were performed at Duke Medicine's Preston Robert Tisch Brain Tumor Center. The results confirmed what doctors had feared. Gary Carter had grade 4 glioblastoma multiforme. Glioblastoma multiforme, often called GBM, is the most common and most aggressive form of primary brain cancer in adults. It begins in star-shaped cells in the brain called astrocytes. Unlike some cancers that form neat, clear tumors that surgeons can cut out, GBM spreads into nearby brain tissue without forming clean edges. It invades, it grows along pathways that the brain uses every day, and it does this quickly. Because of how it spreads, it is extremely difficult to treat. Since its clinical classification, only 4 drugs and 1 medical device have been approved by the FDA to treat glioblastoma, and none of them have been able to extend long-term survival in most patients. The disease is simply that resistant, that aggressive, that relentless. For Gary Carter, the situation was made even more serious by the fact that his 4 tumors were spread across the back of his brain. The location made surgery impossible. His cancer was deemed entirely inoperable from the moment it was discovered. There was no cutting it out. There was only fighting it with the tools available. Under the care of renowned neuro-oncologists, Dr. Henry Friedman and Dr. Alan Friedman at Duke Medicine, Carter began a treatment program that combined radiation with oral chemotherapy using a drug called temozolomide, an alkylating agent that works by damaging the DNA of cancer cells. The side effects of this treatment were grueling: fatigue, nausea, weakness, the kind of exhaustion that is hard to describe to someone who has not lived through it. And yet, through all of it, Gary Carter remained positive. He continued to support his college baseball team. He showed up when he could. His daughter Kimmy kept a Caringbridge blog to share his updates with the thousands of fans who were praying for him. The outpouring of love and support from the baseball community was immediate and enormous. For a time, it seemed possible that Carter might beat the odds. He was strong. He had always been strong. He was stubborn in the best possible way, the kind of stubborn that refuses to accept defeat even when defeat seems certain. But glioblastoma is not an opponent that yields to stubbornness or strength or faith or love. By late 2011, the aggressive nature of the disease began to overwhelm his defenses. He suffered repeated balance issues. On Christmas Eve of 2011, he fell. In early January of 2012, he fell again. That second fall caused a complete rotator cuff tear in his shoulder. The man who had caught for 19 years in the major leagues, who had absorbed thousands of foul tips and collisions at the plate, now could not stand without the risk of falling. The follow-up MRI on January 19, 2012, brought the news everyone had been dreading. Several new tumors had developed across his brain. The cancer had bypassed the treatments. It had found ways around the drugs and the radiation. It had kept growing. The fight was not over, but the nature of the fight had changed under the care of his personal physician. Dr. James Harris, Gary Carter was transitioned to hospice care at his home in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. He came home. He was surrounded by his family, by Sandy, his wife of nearly 4 decades, by his children and grandchildren, by the people who had always mattered most to him, the people he had always chosen over parties and nightlife and the trappings of fame. Gary Carter passed away on February 16, 2012. He was 57 years old, the same age, nearly as his mother had been when leukemia took her. The same disease that his foundation had spent years funding research to fight. Life had come full circle in the most heartbreaking way possible. The baseball world reacted with profound grief. Johnny Bench posted a moving tribute, honoring the loss of the kid and remembering his infectious charm. Dwight Gooden spoke of their close bond. The Wally Backman described Carter as a big brother figure who led by example. People who had once mocked his smile or called him Camera Carter now spoke only of his greatness and his goodness. Some fans, particularly those who had followed baseball through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, began asking a question that had no easy answer. Had something about baseball caused Gary Carter's cancer? Because Carter was not alone in his diagnosis. Over a span of roughly 25 years, several prominent Major League Baseball figures died from glioblastoma at relatively young ages, where AstroTurf was the playing surface from 1971 through 2003. When a journalist at the Philadelphia Inquirer analyzed the data, the estimate was that the brain cancer rate among the players who had spent time on that turf was roughly 3 times higher than the rate in the average adult male population. That number alarmed people. The scientists and epidemiologists began looking closely at 3 possible explanations. The first was the AstroTurf itself. The testing of historical veteran stadium turf confirmed the presence of 16 different subtypes of per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, chemicals often called PFAS or forever chemicals. These are used in manufacturing to make materials resistant to heat, water, and stains. Exposure has been linked to health problems affecting the liver, kidneys, and immune system. But brain tumor specialists, including Dr. Kyle Walsh and Dr. Timothy Rebick, pointed out a critical problem with this theory. Compounds have very poor ability to cross the blood-brain barrier. Concentrations of these chemicals in brain tissue are often 1,000 times lower than what appears in other organs. That makes a direct link to brain tumors scientifically unlikely. The researchers also noted that the NFL's Philadelphia Eagles practiced and played on that exact same turf for years, and public health registries recorded no elevated rate of brain cancer in that football player population. If the turf was the cause, it should have affected football players too. It did not appear to. The second theory focused on head trauma. 3 of the diagnosed players, including Gary Carter, Darren Dalton, and Johnny Oates, were catchers. The catching is the most physically punishing position on the field, involving repeated collisions and impact from foul tips. Some people wondered whether repeated concussions could trigger brain cancer, but leading neuro-oncologists, including Dr. Henry Friedman, who had treated Carter himself, were clear on this point. There is no clinical or statistical evidence linking mechanical head trauma or concussions to the development of primary brain tumors. Concussions cause real and serious damage, including chronic traumatic encephalopathy and long-term cognitive problems, but they do not appear to cause glioblastoma. The third explanation was the hardest for some people to accept. Most epidemiologists concluded that the baseball brain cancer cases were a tragic statistical coincidence. Glioblastoma is naturally most common in older, non-Hispanic white males, with the highest incidence occurring between the ages of 50 and 75. The Major League Baseball rosters from the late 20th century were almost entirely male and predominantly white, putting them squarely in the highest risk demographic for the disease. When the number of cases was adjusted for those demographic factors, the cluster among former players fit within statistical expectations. It was not, according to the science, caused by the turf or the game. It was a brutal overlap between the demographics of professional baseball and the demographics of a terrible disease. Research has not proven that AstroTurf or baseball caused Gary Carter's cancer. The question has been studied, the theories have been examined, and the answer, according to the best available science, is that there is no confirmed environmental cause. That does not make the deaths any less devastating, but it means that the people who want simple answers may not find them here. Sometimes terrible things happen, and the only honest answer is that we do not fully understand why. On February 24, 2012, a memorial service was held for Gary Carter at Christ Fellowship Church in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. The New York Mets sent a large delegation to honor their former captain, including Wally Backman, Keith Hernandez, Darryl Strawberry, Bobby Ojeda, Rusty Staub, David Wright, and General Manager Sandy Alderson. The church was full of people whose lives Gary Carter had touched, players he had coached, children his foundation had helped, fans who had watched him play and felt something special just from being in the same stadium. The Carter family asked that instead of flowers, people donate to the Gary Carter Foundation to support Palm Beach Atlantic University Baseball, the Autism Project of Palm Beach County, and Hospice of Palm Beach County. The community responded with generosity. 8 days after his death, the Montreal Canadiens held a pregame ceremony to honor Carter. Their players wore number 8 jerseys during warm-ups. The mascot Yuppie, beloved at Expos games for decades, wore an Expos uniform with a commemorative patch. In 2014, a banner reading "Merci, Thank You" was unveiled at Olympic Stadium during a Mets and Blue Jays exhibition game, attended by Sandy and Kimmy. These tributes reflected something important. Gary Carter was not beloved at arm's length. He was beloved personally, by people who felt that he had actually seen them, actually cared about them. He actually meant the things he said when he smiled and signed that card from his Bible and handed it to a child who had waited in the summer heat just to shake his hand. There's a version of Gary Carter's story that focuses only on the tragedy. A boy who lost his mother at 12. An athlete who gave up football to injury. A catcher who punished his body for nearly 2 decades. A man mocked by teammates for being too decent. A Hall of Famer diagnosed with inoperable brain cancer and dead at 57. There's enough darkness in that list to fill a dozen sad stories. But that version misses the point of Gary Carter because he never defined himself by any of those things. He defined himself by how he responded to them. He responded to his mother's death by finding faith and honoring her memory through charity. He responded to his knee injury by becoming one of the greatest catchers in baseball history. He responded to the mocking in the clubhouses by showing up every single day and being himself anyway, until the people who had doubted him understood what they had been looking at all along. He responded to brain cancer by staying positive and present, making sure his family and his players knew he was not going to stop being Gary Carter just because the disease wanted him to. He gave everything to baseball. He gave his body to the catching position until it had almost nothing left to give. He gave his mind to understanding every hitter and pitcher and every situation the game could present. He gave his heart to his teammates, even when some of them did not want it. And he gave his legacy to the children who needed something to believe in. The kid never really stopped being a kid in the best possible sense. He never lost the wonder. He never lost the hustle. He never lost the joy of being on the field, of being part of something bigger than himself, of teaching the next generation how to play the game. Right? He carried his grief and his faith and his pain and his love all at once and made it look like something worth having. Because it was the Gary Carter left behind Sandy, his partner from the very beginning, the woman he married on February 8, 1975, and never stopped being devoted to. He left behind Christy, Kimmy, and DJ. He left behind grandchildren, who will grow up knowing their grandfather was one of the finest men this sport has ever produced. He left behind a foundation, still doing the work he started. He left behind a Hall of Fame plaque in Cooperstown that tells only a fraction of the story. He left behind the memory of that Game 6 single and the voice in the dugout shouting that the Mets were still alive and the catcher already putting on his gear before the next inning had started. The cancer took Gary Carter's life at 57. It took him far too soon, just as leukemia had taken his mother 46 years earlier. That symmetry is almost too painful to look at directly. But here's what cancer could never take. It could not take the way a young catcher from Fullerton, California, with a bad knee and a heart full of grief, decided to smile anyway, and run out every ground ball and call every pitcher by name, and build a foundation that fed children and funded research and put books in the hands of kids who needed them. It could not take the way his teammates eventually came around, the way Montreal still puts up banners for him, the way fans who never watched him play still feel something when they hear his name. The kid, the fighter, the father, the coach, the man who stood alone in the clubhouse because he had decided to be something better, and who stood tall at the end because that decision had always been right. The Gary Carter did not just play baseball. He showed us how to play the game of life with joy, with faith, with your whole heart, and with that smile, that great, enormous, unstoppable smile that cancer and grief and pain and all the hard years could never, not once, fully take away.